This lecture is going to be on Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, sort of the first book, which is divided into 13 chapters. And I'm going to go through basically each chapter and give a little breakdown overview in a way so that you can kind of get a picture for what exactly is going on in this text. Some of what I'll be going over here will be a little bit more in the weeds than is, I would say, necessary, but in a class like this where we're reading and trying to appreciate some of the classic philosophical texts, it's worthwhile, I think, to spend a little bit more time, especially at the beginning, kind of getting an understanding of the lay of the land, getting an understanding of what exactly Aristotle's doing, how sort of technical he is, and what kinds of things are sort of interesting and relevant to him in his mind as he's going through this sort of set of basically lectures that he's giving. I'm calling it human functioning and human flourishing, as those are going to be two of the sort of core or central ideas that ground his entire theory. Book 1 gives us the sort of architectural structure to the entirety of the Nicomachean Ethics. And in Book 1, you don't really get either a full account of Aristotle's theory of happiness or of and a full account of his theory of virtue, whereas instead it specifies the questions that the rest of the book has to answer. Namely, it sort of defines, it asks whether or not Aristotle's definition is a genuinely explanatory one that will give us an adequate theory of ethics. And his definition, his sort of theory, the core of his theory, is that happiness, or eudaimonia, is activity of the soul in accordance with virtue over a complete life. The rest of the entire text basically tries to unpack, test, and ultimately revise this formula in order to sort of help one understand exactly what Aristotle's theory is. In the beginning, Aristotle begins with a pretty general claim that you might find puzzling, but it makes sense once you start to think about it. He says that basically every activity, art, inquiry, every kind of action that one can undertake, any sort of deliberate pursuit that you might undertake, aims at some good. Where the word good here is kind of functioning initially as what we might think of as functionally good or teleologically good. It means that it's the sake for which the activity is undertaken. And this is not yet a sort of moral understanding of what it is that we're after. The idea here is just that to say that some activity aims at a good is to say that some activity attempts to achieve something in some way. Sometimes the good of the activity is the activity itself. Sometimes there's a kind of product at the end of the activity, right? So, for example, bridle making is an art form where you try to make bridles, right? And shipbuilding is a kind of activity that you can undertake in attempts to build a ship. Medicine, right? The practice of medicine attempts at making people healthy. Whereas, on the other hand, we have other kinds of activities where, say, like the exercise of research is in order to come to have more knowledge of some activity of something. Basically, the pursuit of knowledge is knowledge, right? In that kind of way, right? So this is an activity that one can undertake with something that's not exactly a product at the end, but it's some kind of other good. And then Aristotle wants to distinguish between different kinds of arts or different kinds of activities, some of which are subordinated, right, between one and the other, right? Certain sort of master arts or arts aims at which there's sort of a more general choice at which you're trying to do something, right? So for instance, the example he gives is bridle making is subordinate to horsemanship. So horsemanship would be taking care of horses and raising, and horsemanship though, and other as a sort of military practice would be subordinate to general military strategy, right? So like making horse bridles is subject to being better at horsemanship in general, and being good at horsemanship is subject to being good at military strategy. So you can sort of think, right, depending on the activity and the goods or ends of the activity, there's a sort of structural implication here, right? If the practical ends form a hierarchy, there may be some sort of highest practical end on which the others are going to rest, right? So this isn't simply sort of an empirical observation about motives, but instead establishes a kind of structure to the character of ethics itself. Aristotle wants to suggest that whether a subordinate pleasure or a subordinate pursuit is good, one must know the kind of wider ends for which the particular pursuit is chosen. So take your own case, right? So ask yourself, why are you taking this class? Why are you studying in school? Why are you trying to do better at the upcoming test than your fellow classmate, or just like why are you trying to better yourself here in some case, way, shape, or form? If I asked you, why are you in this class? You might say, well, I need to get a good grade in this class. And then I can ask you the further question, okay, well, so that's, why you're studying, why you're listening to this lecture right now, right? That's an activity. And the activity is aimed at the goal of allowing you to get a better grade on the next exam, which getting a better grade on the next exam will help you get a better grade in this class, right? So getting a good grade on the exam is subordinate to getting a good grade in the class. Well, getting a good grade in the class, right, is a subordinate aim or goal to it, but it's an activity that you can undertake towards getting a degree from the university, right? So as you're trying to get a college degree, you're trying to graduate from undergrad, you got to do that. There are the means of doing that, and then there's the goal, right? So some of the means involve taking this class right now, but the sort of larger means to getting the degree, of course, are getting good grades in classes so that you can fulfill all the requirements of the degree. But then I can ask you again, why this degree? Why Cal Poly? What are you doing here? Why are you trying to get a degree? What's the good of it? What's the good of the degree? And you might say, well, because I want to do well beyond that. I want to be able to have a career. I want to be able to have some sort of ability to support myself, ability to support my family. I want to have a life that's fulfilled in some ways. I want to have a good and interesting career. And then I can ask you once again, well, why in the hell would you want any of those things? And there you should start to see that there's a kind of end point at which we're going to be achieving, which is, well, the reason that I want to have a good job and that I want to have a successful career is because I want to live a fulfilled life full of the sort of normal goods that a fulfilled life would have. I want to live well, and a good, full, and interesting life is one in which we as humans generally have a kind of purpose that which we aim. We try to, better ourselves or better others, or, make money, which hopefully is also to help better others, or to start a business because you believe in that, or to have a family because you think, raising children is worthwhile or good, or something along these lines, right? So, and if once you get to those kinds of questions, if I start asking you like, well, why do you want to live a life that's enjoyable? Why do you want to live a good life? Then you're going to look at me funny. You're going to be like, wait a minute, no, that kind of question doesn't actually make sense. That's the kind of thing for which the question sort of ends, right? Like there's just the final things that are the worthwhile ends that are chosen for their own sake, right? These are just the highest of the high goals. These aren't goals by which I'm attempting to achieve some further goal. This is the goal. This is why it is that I'm doing any and all of the things that I'm trying to do. And that's basically Aristotle's point here, is that he's trying to just point out that, look, for any and all activities that you can imagine undertaking, there's going to be this kind of hierarchy. There's always the question of, well, why are you doing that? What are you trying to achieve in doing that? And then with respect to this hierarchy, there's always going to be this sort of final master end at the end of the day, at the top of the pyramid, right? For which all of the things that you do are the ultimate kind of reason. And insofar as there is this height to the pyramid, this top piece of the puzzle, you might think, well, that kind of thing, and the subsequent things near the top are the things that are more choice-worthy, right? Like taking this class. Would you rather take this class or have a successful career, right? Well, obviously, the having a successful career is the more choice-worthy of the options. The problem is, they're not on the same kind of playing field. If only, right? If only you could just skip taking this class and immediately have a successful career, or it only was, by taking this class you would immediately have a successful career. That would be fantastic, but it doesn't work that way, sadly. But the idea that Aristotle's trying to point out here really is just that the ends at the top of the hierarchy are more often perceived as better, perceived as the ones that are more worthwhile, the ones more worth pursuing. At this point, Aristotle converts the hierarchy of ends into a kind of anti-regress argument. He says that, like, if every end were chosen only for some further end, then desire would proceed indefinitely and become empty and vain. The basic idea being, if there was some further reason always to desire any particular end, then there would just never be some ultimate thing to desire, and so all activity that had any particular aim would, he think, be empty. Therefore, he thinks there must be some end desired for itself, that thing being the chief good, the most good thing that can be desired. Knowledge, he thinks, of this end matters practically when it comes to deciding what to do, right? So he gives the sort of picture of archers aiming at a mark, right? Knowing what it is that you have to do in order to aim at a mark is really matters for what you're doing as an archer, right? If you're an archer, you have to know what it is that you need to do in order to aim at and then fire on the target of a bullseye, right? And the idea here is that this is similar to what ethics is. Like, ethics, he thinks, is an action guiding sort of skill. It's an action guide. Like, it's kind of knowledge of ethics involves understanding what the chief good is that we need to attempt to pursue, that we need to attempt to aim at. We need a determinate target in order to think and coordinate our actions well in the right sort of way so that we can do a good job at taking the means that we need to take in order to achieve our subordinate ends that will eventually build up towards that ultimate end, right? And this is, the same idea as what I was just saying about, taking this class in order to get a good grade, in order to get a degree, in order to get a good career, in order to, go on and on. So the target he thinks, or the way that Aristotle likes to think about this, and this is slightly different than the way that we would put it nowadays, but this is kind of the beginning of this way of thinking, belongs to what he calls politics. He takes politics to be the most authoritative, or the architectonic practical science. Politics, he thinks, is what it determines the disciplines citizens should learn, which actions and abstentions we should enact as laws, and how other practical disciplines in his context, strategy, household management, and rhetoric, will serve civic life. Now this is sort of confusing, I think, but the point, I think, can be made a little bit more clear using some more contemporary ideas. But the idea is that the human good is irreducibly political. And what exactly does that mean? Well, political, understanding what politics is understanding how it is that we as humans interact with one another and are able to, let's say, form institutions, live together for the goodness of the group, right? There's, of course, going to be the particular individual, right? So, like, I can think about the goodness of myself and what's good for me and what's good for how I am going to live interpersonally. But when it comes to thinking in general about morality, morality, we're talking about, what's right and what's wrong with respect to the actions that I take that affect you, that affect other people. That what actions should we take as a group to be the most just for all? Those are inherently political ideas. And because those are political ideas, we need to take seriously the idea of the ultimate sort of, like, the chief good when it comes to thinking about ethics in general, it being the chief good of a political society. I mean, basically, in a certain sense, if you were thinking about, like, what it is that you're doing and what you're trying to achieve is living a really good life at the end of the day. If we were starting to think about, like, how it is that we as a society could best live together, we as, a state, or we as a country, what would be the best, way for all of for those kinds of things to be? Well, in that kind of context, then, like, a certain sort of political good is going to be the best thing that sort of helps guide our actions with respect to understanding what it is that we should and shouldn't do in how we treat one another. This idea basically supplies the sort of political horizon for the ethical analysis that follows in the rest of Book 1. In Chapter 3 of this first book, Aristotle kind of slows down. He makes a kind of aside. This chapter is an aside from the main points that he's trying to make so far, but he seems compelled to state some things about the methods that he's using. So this kind of occurs over and over again in his writings. He begins and starts to give these sort of grand ideas, and then before he gets into some of the nitty-gritty arguments that he wants to give, he starts making asides and starts referring to other things outside to try and get you on board in various ways. Sometimes these are helpful and sometimes these aren't, but for our purposes here, I think it's worth it just because we're the way that we're reading this text to go through it. At least I can go through it, and you can listen. Though this particular section isn't as important right now, though it may come up again later. So in chapter 3, Aristotle warns against demanding any kind of mathematical precision when it comes to interpreting ethical, like when it comes to thinking about matters of action. Right. So he thinks that just actions are going to vary by context and admit of disagreement, like what things you should do or what things are acceptable things to do in particular contexts are open to disagreement without necessarily being incorrect. Moreover, apparent goods such as like things like being wealthy, having a lot of money, being courageous, he thinks that certain kinds of things like this, and this will come up later, can actually harm their possessors. People that are wealthy, their wealth can harm them. People that are courageous sometimes can find themselves in situations that are bad for them on the basis of the fact that they were the ones that were like, yeah, like I'll be the one that marches into war. Ethical inquiry, he thinks, then consequently will deliver truths in a kind of rough outline, where they're sort of valid for the most part, but not necessarily exceptionless. Now, this view that he's giving is not really, it's not a form of relativism, because Aristotle doesn't want to say that justice itself is merely conventional, dependent upon what people agree to or something like that. He thinks that instead that political matters are just variable enough that their treatment, the sort of interpretation of them, cannot take the form of a strict demonstration from necessary premises, something that you might find in like mathematical treatise. The appropriate epistemic standard, he thinks, must be proportionate to the object at hand, the object of study. This chapter then also defines what he thinks of as the appropriate student of ethics. And when it comes to fully sort of understanding what's going on here, he sort of lays it out clearly that he thinks young people are actually quite centrally unsuited to political science, but not primarily because of age, but because of the inadequate experience that they've had, right? And because they don't yet have a full they haven't developed a virtuous character yet, right? As youth, you are almost always, your character is governed by passion. You have not come to be able to control all of the things that you ought to be able to control as a full-fledged adult. And he thinks that since ethics aims not at sort of just knowledge, but at action, someone unwilling to live by a rational principle will gain no practical benefit from understanding its arguments. So the sort of implication here is that ethical theory presupposes a certain amount of ethical formation. That is, you need to already sort of be a little bit along the path of understanding ethical thinking in order for you to actually find compelling any of the arguments involved in ethical theorizing. He thinks that habituation provides some of this for someone with some experience, right? So a person that has some experience in basically growing up at this point and in trying to live an ethical, moral life will have some grasp of the starting points of what it takes to live an ethical life, what it takes to live a life that Aristotle will eventually say is something that is eudaimonic. Before any philosophical analysis explains or systematizes what exactly it takes to live this kind of life. 4 of Book 1, we have Aristotle suggesting that there's widespread agreement that the highest good, the thing that is most choice-worthy of our aims, is happiness, or eudaimonia. In other words, living well and doing well throughout one's entire life. Happiness here is not to be thought of as the mere fleeting emotion that we tend to have when we feel good. Instead, it's to be thought of as a sort of longer lasting achievement that can be gotten by effort and toil throughout over time, but sort of thinking of it as someone that is actually flourishing, living a full and flourishing life. But even though there is this sort of topical level of agreement, the name happiness, or eudaimonia, which literally just means something along the lines of good demon or good spirit, conceals a lot of disagreement. There are a number of things that people think happiness is, that people think good spirit is, that people think come with these things, and one of them really is, I think, in a sense, that happiness feeling, like pleasure. There's a distinction. There's a disagreement here, which we'll get into more detail in a second. But between some people say that pleasure is what happiness consists in. Others say wealth, honor, good health, all of these kinds of things offer possible underlying explanations of what exactly happiness is. Aristotle's going to discuss this, but first he needs to introduce what he thinks of as a sort of methodological distinction when it comes to reasoning. And that distinction is between two different directions that we might reason from. On the one hand, we can reason from first principles, and on the other, we might reason towards first principles. In ethics and ethical inquiry, we begin, he thinks, with what is known to us already. The ethically formed person's ability to practically recognize that certain actions are good and other actions are bad or shameful, it doesn't derive from some theoretically self-evident first principle, right? Something like a mathematical principle that one might reason to it having to be true. Instead, he thinks that a form of good upbringing, basically a form of good initial habituation brought to you by your parents and the people around you, the people that teach you, the society, the political structure that you're in, supplies basically part of the fact from which the later kind of understanding of what's right and wrong proceeds. So he thinks that basically this account, this chapter sort of famously appeals to a need for basic habituation within ethics in order for you to even already be akin to understanding what right and wrong are to begin with. He thinks ethical first principles are not acquired by deduction. This is going to, in a certain sense, be a sticking point between Aristotle and Kant later, where Kant is going to think that Some maybe understanding of ethical reasoning can come by way of a first principle, by way of very abstract rational reasoning. Instead, he thinks that ethical principles are apprehended through living a life in which desires and perceptions have been trained to sort of register the ethically salient features of situations, that they're gonna, like, your own abilities to sort of tell you when something is the good thing, when something is the bad thing, when something is the right thing to do, when something is the wrong thing to do. Those habits need to have sort of been instilled in you a little bit in order for you to sort of get onto the ability to think ethically already from the get-go. Then in chapter 5 of book 1, Aristotle begins to discuss what he takes to be sort of the most adequate and why some of them are inadequate explanations of what candidates really could be what underlie happiness. He offers three common conceptions by examining certain prominent lives that are lived under these conceptions. So first, the life of enjoyment, where we understand happiness in terms of pleasure. Second, the political life, where we understand happiness in terms of honor, or perhaps the seeking of virtue. And third, we have the contemplative life, the life that is a life filled with contemplation. Hint, hint, this is going to be Aristotle's favorite because he is a philosopher, which he will eventually kind of treat more seriously later. And there's reason for thinking, like he takes this more seriously, but he sort of casts out the others for various reasons. But first, so the life of enjoyment, the life of happiness as pleasure, he thinks has got to fall short, because he thinks of it as slavish or bestial, since it treats bodily pleasure as sovereign. And the thought here is that sort of, you might call this the sex, drugs, and rock and roll view, right? That the highest pleasure, the highest thing that lies behind happiness is the satisfaction of your animal appetites. And that, I think, we generally can recognize as, well, in some cases, an achievable form of happiness for some. We do not think of it as the most choice-worthy form of happiness, right? We don't think of it as the highest, most successful, greatest thing that's worth pursuing, right? It's not that pleasure is bad per se. It's that pleasure should accompany that which is even greater, that which is even more worthy of pursuit. The pursuit of honor, or sort of greatness, maybe in political life, he also thinks is not the right kind of thing to suggest as being the most choice-worthy form of happiness, that is the most choice-worthy thing to attempt to try and aim your life at. While it improves on a sort of hedonistic attempt at achieving pleasure, he thinks that while it's more elevated, honor cannot be the final good, because honor depends on those who bestow it. And the basic idea there is, in order to be honorable, it's the reason that honor can't be the thing that is the highest thing to achieve is because other people have to treat you in a certain way in order for you to have honor. Whereas he thinks that the chief good should be proper to its possessor, that is, difficult to remove, is a way of putting it, where people seek honor and try to receive honor from others, basically try to get recognition for how great they are in some way, shape, or form. The idea is just that. It's that Aristotle thinks this can't be the greatest thing because it's sort of external to you, whether or not people see you as honorable, whether or not people see you as great. Your happiness cannot be, your success in life should not be beholden to those outside of you thinking that your life is successful, right? So while people seek honor, are the people that seek honor are somewhat like practically wise. Their real aspiration is to be good, right? Not merely to be honored. The idea is that you are good in a way that people see, and then they honor you for that goodness, right? But the virtue conceived, sort of the thing it is that you're trying to do to be good, that's the thing that is worthy of honor. And so that's the thing that Aristotle thinks is got to be the thing that's the most sought after, right? Well, he also says something like, look, like someone can have the virtue that is the goodness that could live this happy life, could be this fulfilled individual, while sleeping, or while inactive, or while even suffering possibly from some sort of extreme misfortune, which precludes them from receiving honor from other individuals. But that doesn't necessarily take away from their successful flourishing in their life. This is part of why Aristotle thinks that happiness has to be an activity. It has to be something lived. It can't be a static state, or a state that is sort of cast on to someone or attributed to someone, right? It's not the kind of property that can be given, like I dub thee happy or something like that, right? Where that is kind of how honor ends up working, being a person that is honorable, being a person that is successful in the eyes of others, rather than merely successful. And finally, Aristotle treats wealth as a sort of very briskly, saying that it is undertaken under compulsion. But wealth is clearly not something valuable for its own sake, right? Wealth is, if anything, merely instrumentally valuable. That is valuable on behalf of something else. You accumulate wealth in order to accumulate something else. So it can't be the ultimate highest end. There's no reason to accumulate wealth if you're not also already seeking something else, right? And this is, that's the same, the normal adage, right? Where money isn't happiness. Money can't even necessarily buy you happiness, right? Maybe it can get you a little closer, but accumulation of wealth is not worth pursuing for its own sake, right? You don't try to accumulate wealth in order to try to accumulate wealth, right? You try to accumulate wealth because it will help provide for the opportunity for you to be successful in other endeavors, namely, hopefully, the kinds of endeavors that fulfill your life, that bring with it a worthwhile, fulfilled, happiness. In chapter 6, Aristotle makes another kind of aside, but this time to criticize his teacher's account of goodness, Plato, as universally singular or unitary. So, classically, if you've never heard of this before, the Platonic form of goodness, Plato's idea is that for every sort of general term that we have, there is going to be some kind of perfect form of that thing that exists in a place that we might call platonic heaven, right? So, right, the ultimate form of the hamburger, or the ultimate form of the car, the perfect car, or the ultimate form of music, of a song, right? Something along those lines. Like, he gets this kind of idea, I think, from mathematics, right? There's like the perfect form of a circle. You've all heard that, like, it's impossible to draw an actually perfect circle in reality, right? But we all understand the idea of a perfect circle. Similarly, Plato thinks that there's a perfect form of the good itself. But Aristotle wants to say, look, like, that's fine, but kind of useless in a certain sense. He thinks, look, there's another. We can't take seriously just because we're friends that this might be far from the truth, and so he wants to criticize Plato, but while calling him friend, right? He thinks, look, the notion of goodness is predicated across a number of different categories: substance, quality, quantity, relation, time, place, right? The idea there being that all kinds of things can be understood in terms of good, right? Like, whereas a single form can't straightforwardly explain goods that belong to these different modes of being. There are different kinds of goods, and because there are different kinds of goods, like, one unitary notion of good doesn't explain how there can be different kinds of good, right? Another way of thinking about this is that if a single form of the good corresponded to all goods, then there would need to be a particular science of good itself. In fact, a practical discipline that achieved goodness in some way, shape, or form as its aim. But that also doesn't really make sense. There is no science of goodness itself. There's just different kinds of sciences that attempt to achieve goodness with respect to their different particular main aims, right? So, like, military strategy tries to be successful, be good in a moment of war or in a moment of posturing. Medicine attempts to be good when it comes to the treating of illnesses. Different kinds of practices need to be good in different kinds of ways. And if there was one unitary form of goodness, then it wouldn't really explain how being good at war and being good at medicine are in any way, shape, or form the same, right? The idea here is goodness comes sort of ready-made for the particular practice that the goodness is understood in terms of. And then third, finally, the form of goodness lacks any kind of practical usefulness. So if there were a separate universal notion of the good, then it wouldn't itself be attainable as a particular human end, right? There would have to be something good apart from even humanity, like the good for humanity as itself, right? You can think of it sort of maybe along these lines. A physician, when they're treating a patient, tries to heal the patient's ailment, not bring about health itself, right? The physician doesn't somehow, think, okay, like, well, we need everyone healthy, and so I'm going to treat everyone by treating you. No, when they're trying to heal you, they're trying to bring about your health. They're trying to bring about, like, your well-being, not health itself. right? Whatever that concept is. They're not trying to make universal health, right, or something like that. Similarly, a person that say makes clothing, or a general in the military, anyone that has a particular craft, anyone that does a particular thing, they're not going to be given any guidance on what it is that they need to do to be successful at their particular craft, by contemplating goodness itself in the abstract. But Aristotle thinks, if thinking about morality has to do, gets you at thinking about goodness in the abstract, well, you're doing it wrong, right? Because thinking about morality is supposed to tell you at least something about what you should be doing today in your daily life. And thinking about what goodness is in the abstract doesn't do that. So the criticism here, it doesn't really deny that that the notion of good can't come in an ordered or related way. It doesn't mean that different goods can't be connected. Instead, it rejects the idea that there's a kind of unity or a singularness to the universal notion of goodness, and that's the thing that we ought to be trying to seek out when we're doing ethics, trying to understand when we're doing ethics. He thinks, no, ethics itself must seek out the humanly achievable good. That is, there needs to be clear practical guidelines for what it is that we're doing in ethics, that come from an understanding of what it is to aim at the fundamentally human good at the core, right? Returning from his aside, Aristotle returns to discussion of happiness as the sort of final aim, the final end for which we aim. He argues that, look, many things for which we might aim, wealth, honor, pleasure, success, all of these things are always chosen for something else's sake, right? We want to be wealthy so that it can bring us other goods. We want honor because we think that that will bring about happiness or pleasure. We want pleasure because we think that that will bring about happiness. But happiness itself, human flourishing, he thinks must be the final end because it is chosen for itself. When you choose to pursue happiness, we don't choose to pursue it for the sake of something beyond it. If I asked you, why are you trying to be happy? Again, nothing comes to mind, right? It is the final end that gives subordinate pursuits their point. And so for Aristotle, the sort of finality of happiness, when it comes to thinking about pursuits with respect to action, is part of what makes it the core of his ethical theory. He's like, look, we can start to understand how things work once we understand the structure of how happiness has to be, or human flourishing has to be, the end without qualification under which we all act, the thing that we all pursue. Another feature of happiness that makes a happy life the most choice-worthy of lives, according to Aristotle, is that happiness is self-sufficient in isolation. And what he means by that is not that a self-sufficient solitary individual is somehow happy. He thinks that human happiness probably requires interaction, including being a parent of a child or having children, friends, being a citizen in a country, something along those lines. But no, what he means here is that happiness requires nothing beyond itself, right? There's a kind of limit here that is that there's nothing in if someone is happy, if someone is living a flourishing life, nothing can be added to that life that would make it in any sense more happy or more flourishing. This is a kind of idealization, right? That the achievement of true flourishing requires nothing more than what it is, and that's part of Aristotle's idea, right? So happiness is the thing that's worth pursuing for its own sake. It's an end in itself. It's the most, and then one of the reasons for it being the most choice-worthy of things to seek out, to pursue, is because you can't get better than happiness, right? Than flourishing, right? Like, it is the end of the road there, that you don't get like, god tier flourishing. No, like, we're talking about flourishing. It's like the infinite. When you add infinity to infinity, you still have infinity, right? The idea here being flourishing is just the end all be all, and you can't do anything about making it better. Now, Aristotle recognizes that saying that happiness is the chief good, or the thing that we all must aim at in all of our human-born activity and attempt to achieve a flourishing life, he recognizes that that's kind of an empty statement. He recognizes that he hasn't filled it out yet. He hasn't explained what exactly it means to pursue happiness. So, in an attempt to define this, he's going to talk a little bit more about. He's going to give this idea of a human function, and this famously is what is called the function argument. So, sort of moving beyond claiming that happiness is the chief good, he looks for what exactly it is that is the ergon, or the characteristic activity of being a human being. And he proceeds by a kind of exclusion, right? So he says, look, human activity is not just sort of living and growing, right? Metabolizing food, eating things, right? Because nutrition and growth are things that we share with plants. Plants are alive. We think of plants as living, and plants grow, and in some cases are able to even move. So human function can't be just living and growing. Similarly, human function can't, the core of human function, or what humans are sort of the main function of humans, can't be perception either, because perception and sort of like full mobility, I guess you might say, is also shared with other animals. And here we're looking for we don't treat animal activity as moral activity, and we also don't think of what is good for animals as the same as what is good for humans, right? Like, animals, in attempting to live their best lives, we don't think morality necessarily applies to them, and we don't think of animal lives as achieving anything close to what human lives can achieve, insofar as an animal life can aim towards achieving anything. So what exactly is it that is distinctive about human life? And Aristotle arrives at rationally informed activity. Basically, he thinks of what the human function, the human ergon, the activity of a human soul, is a soul involving an active life of a soul involving a rational principle. Here, a soul basically just meaning like the thing that moves us. And so the idea is that one of the aspects of our soul is that we possess and exercise rationality, insofar as we are able to see that certain things count as reasons and act on those reasons, and basically use those reasons to both justify our actions and act on the basis of seeing, hey, that's a reason to do that. Okay, cool. I'm gonna go do that. Basically, that's the core of what Aristotle thinks is distinctively human, and so he's going to put that at the core of what it is for understanding the human function. This brings us to probably the most important principle or thing that Aristotle does throughout the course of the Nicomachean Ethics, which is to elaborate on this particular bridge from sort of natural facts, his naturalistic understanding, to normative claims. Basically, what he thinks is that we can understand that a particular thing is good when it performs its function well, when it performs its function in accordance with particular virtues that make up it being an excellent kind of the thing that it is. So let's take this is sort of the overdone and well-worn example that gets used in this kind of case all the time. Think of a thing like a knife. Knives are obviously tools that we use with purpose. Knives have purposes. And the purpose of a knife, pretty obviously, is to cut things, right? A knife cuts. Well, if you have a knife, there's a distinction between, or we can draw a distinction between a knife that's good and a knife that's not so good. Well, what is it that makes a knife good? Well, a knife that's good is going to be a knife that is good at cutting. Okay, great. So a good knife is a knife that's good at cutting. But what is it that makes a knife good at cutting? Well, a good knife has to have particular virtues. It has to have particular features that make it good at cutting, right? So for one thing that is required to be good at cutting is that the knife itself be sharp. Another thing that is required for a knife to be good at cutting is that the knife is sturdy in some way, right? It can't be flimsy. It can't sort of falter or cut not in a direct line. And similarly, it must be easy to use in some way. If it's not easy to use in pursuit of its purpose, then it's not going to function well as a knife. Now the same basic idea that can be applied so easily to a knife can be applied, Aristotle thinks, to a human and to identify what exactly it is that we ought to be doing as humans, right? So he thinks that basically the human good or happiness or flourishing is going to be, you take the human purpose, which he sees as rational activity, the thing that makes us human, the sort of thing that is characteristically different about us and distinguishes us from other creatures on this planet, our rational activity. And he thinks that undertaking rational activity, or the rational activity of the soul, in accordance with virtue, is what makes us able to have a flourishingly good human life, right? So a human that acts in a particular way on the basis of the sort of good-making features of living a rational life, that's going to be the thing that makes us good as humans, and that's going to give us sort of the same kind of picture. Like, okay, what is it that makes a knife good? Well, a knife's purpose is to cut, so a good knife is one that is good at cutting. What is it that makes a human good? Well, if a good human is one that is flourishing, so one that is good at undertaking the things that are required in order for a human to flourish as the kind of thing that it is, namely a rational creature, that's going to be the kind of thing that makes a human a good one. In this case, we end up with a number of qualifications that matter for Aristotle here. Happiness is then an activity. It involves particular actions and habits and an attempt to to do things in a certain sense, right? You have to live in accordance with a particular understanding of what it is that your purpose is or what it is that you're trying to do, rather than having some possession of an inner feeling, right? It's not that like you can be happy by just feeling good. In order to be happy, you have to be living well. It's also an activity that's in accordance with virtue. So this isn't merely like a rational calculation. It's not merely thinking correctly about what it is that you ought to do. It's that you are in the process of thinking. The thinking itself has to be also sort of well formed, well situated, well done. So like rational activity, the idea here is like being good at being rational is part of being good at being human, right? Because rational activity, so like, of course humans, we also live, we metabolize as the plants, we perceive as the animals, but we also have rational activity. So it's got to incorporate sort of all of these things. But one of the things that we can recognize is as good is that if we can live in a way that's good at being rational, then that helps us live helps us be good as a human in the particularly human way that we are. And then similarly, he wants to sort of throw in at the end here that this picture of happiness, this picture of human flourishing must occur over the course of a complete life. It can't be something that happens sort of as a flash in the pan. He says, one swallow does not a summer make, right? Or whatever, right? So you can't have one particular, it's not like one instance of perfection is happiness, right? Happiness is something that constitutes this long drawn out process that is flourishing. Now, this argument then in the end gives us a kind of formal definition, which isn't complete because we haven't filled out what the virtues are yet. But it doesn't also give us any sort of immediate proof that this is actually the correct structure. But this is the basic idea of Aristotle's theory. And then a lot of the rest of this involves sort of filling out some of the details. But the function argument is at the core of understanding what Aristotle is claiming. Again, because just to reiterate, so the function argument ends by claiming that happiness is an activity, not something that's feeling or something that you can possess. It requires virtue, meaning that rational agency must be excellently formed. That is, that the activity of actually reasoning when it comes to thinking through what it is that you're doing must be good. You must be good at it in a certain way. And that requires the virtues, which are the kinds of things that make you good at acting rationally for particular reasons. And then finally, it takes a complete life to understand what it is that a flourishing human life actually must be, right? We can't think of someone as genuinely happy as a child in the sense of, like, of course we can think of them as feeling happy, but we shouldn't think of them as having lived a flourishing life until, the fulfillment of that life. As an attempt then to sort of recap the function argument, we can see that function is useful as a determiner of understanding the purpose and fixes the virtues that are required for a thing's goodness, right? So a thing is good for its kind when it's good at achieving the purpose or aim of the kind of thing that it is. And then so we can determine the aim of a thing to thereby determine what it must be good at doing in order to be good for its kind. So the ways that a thing must be in order to be excellent at achieving the purpose or the purpose that it has, those ways are, we might call, its virtues, the excellences that it must have in order to achieve its purpose. So developing the virtues needed to be good at achieving the goal or purpose of the thing is what in the end is needed for that thing to be good as the kind of thing that it is. And so Aristotle here has attempted to cross this sort of boundary and say, like, look, you've got the kind of thing that something is and the function that it is for, or the purpose that it serves, or the core of its existence, of what the type of thing that it is, like what it was trying to do, and from that we can determine what it is for it to do good, for it to be good as the kind of thing that it is, and from there we can determine what kinds of things it ought to do, what kinds of things it needs to be, what kinds of ways it needs to act or work in order to be good for the kind of thing that it is. So let's take a few real simple examples, akin to the knife example. Take the object of a car. What is the purpose of a car? It's for transportation, right? I mean, most of the time, sometimes it's just to look cool, but for the most part, cars are meant for transportation. What's a virtue of a car being good at transportation? Well, the car being fast, right? At the very least, the car being reliable, and with respect to reliable transportation. But if you're just trying to get from A to B, it'd be nice if the car was fast enough to get you there in a timely manner. That would be a virtue. That would be an excellent way for the car to support its purpose, to achieve its purpose of transportation. An oven. The purpose of an oven is to be able to cook your food, right? And a virtue of an oven, a good oven, is one that's hot or hot enough or can get to the right temperature and let you know that it's at the right temperature for cooking your food. You don't want to have to cook your food at the wrong temperature. If the oven doesn't heat up at all, that would be bad. If it doesn't get high enough for you to cook frozen pizza, that's a bummer. Similarly, another like the temperature gauge, being able to know what heat it's at, is a virtue of an oven, right? Because if your oven is too hot or it runs hot and it doesn't tell you, then you're gonna burn your food. So you're gonna fail at the purpose of the oven, right? A bad oven is one that isn't necessarily good at using to cook. And similar, and then maybe more complicatedly, something that's a little bit more like social. We've got like a sports team. Okay, take the sports team. What's the purpose of a sports team? Well, in a sort of the normal case, right? The kind of team that you and I are on. Hopefully, the point of being on a sports team is to try and win, right? Like what you're trying to do is win, right? A professional sports team, I do wonder if their purpose is actually more to entertain than to win. But you know what I mean here, right? So if you take the purpose of a team in a sport is to win, then the virtue that they, the what's the best way to win? Well, it's to be good at scoring points and defending, right? So offense and defense are virtues of a good sports team. That is, they are excellences of a sports team that make them good at winning, which is what that means. Now, once again, we apply this same picture to humans, and we've got Aristotle's basic idea. What is it that sets a human apart from other creatures, other kinds of things that there are? Rational activity. So we've got humans and their purpose to live lives involving rational activity, and then he thinks that the virtues, the whatever it is that allows us to live good lives of rational activity, are going to be the things that we need to attempt to habituate ourselves towards or cultivate in order to become good at being human, right? At being rational creatures, at living, flourishing human lives. In chapter 8, Aristotle begins to attempt to test his definition so far, and by asking whether or not the view that he has harmonizes with the experiences and opinions of others, right? He thinks that ultimately a correct account should accommodate the actual phenomenon at hand, and agree with most other people's sort of take on what's going on. A false account is going to clash with other people's takes or with other people's experiences in some way, shape, or form. And he does this by sort of thinking, okay, there's generally taken, especially at his time, a division of goods into three different sorts, right? There's external goods, things that are good for you, external, like apart from you, right? Things that are good that could happen to you. There are goods of the body, namely, like things like food, probably sustenance, strength, things that are, good for you as the kind of creature that you are. And then there are goods of the soul. And the idea here is supposed to be that happiness, as he's identified it, is virtuous activity of the soul, and so properly should be identified as something that involves the soul. And he thinks that, look, this gets it kind of right. We don't think of happiness as something external to us. We don't think of happiness as something that has to do with our bodies per se, though it's, related there. But it has more to do with our psyches, like what's going on inside of our internal being. And so it's like by identifying happiness as something to do with the virtuous activity of the soul or the psyche, the mind, Aristotle thinks he's sort of clearly on the right track. But some people have also identified just the notion of being virtuous with happiness. But Aristotle wants to sort of take that a step further and say, look, sure, like you're on the right track if you're identifying virtues, like, being courageous, being magnanimous, being, we'll get to the virtues coming pretty soon. He wants to say, yes, like we can identify being virtuous is really close to being happy, living a good life, but he really wants to focus on the activity part, right? It's got to be like virtues are what are called dispositional traits, right? So a dispositional trait is like like a glass window has the disposition to being broken if you throw a baseball at it or something like that. A vase can will shatter if you drop it. That's a disposition of the vase, right? It's not shattering currently. It's sitting on the pedestal, right? A virtue is similar. A virtue is a dispositional trait, right? So like the disposition, so being courageous basically is the disposition to show like the correct level of bravery or like even fear in the face of danger, right? And you go out and you are able to overcome that danger. But just because you have, courage doesn't mean that you're currently experiencing that courage, right? Because you're not experiencing something intense or dangerous. And Aristotle wants to say, look, so part of living the good life, part of living a flourishing life involves the activity of sort of activating these virtues. So that's why you've got to have this virtuous activity of the soul that makes it the case that you're happy. If you just have these sort of like triggers in the soul, but they're never activated, right? You could have like the most virtuous person in the world, but they're just asleep all the time, right? And in that case, the person wouldn't be living a good life. They would be maybe, a good person if you were to wake them up, but they wouldn't be living a good life. And so what Aristotle thinks is like, the more choice-worthy case, the more choice-worthy thing is the life, like the actual activity of the life. And according to Aristotle's view, happiness can't be sort of captured by any form of crude hedonism or sort of inwardism or sort of solitary, being a solitary individual. He thinks that the virtuous activity of the soul is pleasant in and of itself for the virtuous person. So doing things that are the right thing to do, doing the things that are just, acting in the right kinds of ways are a sort of something that is enjoyed by the person that is doing them. Someone that doesn't enjoy doing the things that are, in the right way isn't going to be a virtuous, happy person. But happiness also, in this kind of case, requires some external goods. So you can't sort of just be happy in and of yourself, right? You need some things to be bestowed upon you, right? You need some goods to be given to you in order to be happy. But you also need to be put in situations where you are able to sort of give to others, activate the happiness of others. You need friends, resources, some sort of. You need to be in some kind of social circle, maybe even some kind of political circle, right? In order to perform various actions that count as good actions, that count as the kinds of things that a good person would do, right? And so in this case, Aristotle thinks, like part of being happy involves living this kind of very full life that requires, being a good friend, having good friends, having good, food, playing sports, probably, like, being in relation to one another socially. In chapter 9, Aristotle asks where happiness comes from, how we can achieve happiness. He asks whether it comes through learning, habituation, training, or some kind of divine providence or chance, whether or not you can just be lucky to be happy, whether or not you could be bestowed happiness by the gods. And he kind of allows for the idea that if anything is to be God-given, or just sort of like divine intervention, a product of chance, happiness would be the right kind of candidate, right? So like just having all of the right kinds of traits and having all of the right kinds of things happen to you. But he does insist that happiness resulting from the cultivation of the virtues is sort of the most godlike and blessed of things, right? The idea here is really a kind of political one. He wants it to be the case that happiness is something that we can work towards through study and care, so that individuals will not be sort of are not unable to achieve virtue and thereby achieve happiness. He thinks that if it's possible for us to work towards achieving virtue and thereby achieving happiness, then happiness and living a good life is broadly a shareable trait, shareable amongst the polis, and shareable amongst those individuals that also live in our political community. And then by this, he wants to then, and eventually will give some sort of support to the idea that at the level of political science, we can give a role to the law and a role to sort of the attempts to educate people in such a way that they can develop their own virtues and thereby hopefully come to become good citizens that live flourishing lives, capable of good actions, and ultimately be happy. Now, in this case, Aristotle really sort of, what he wants to focus on is this notion of chance, right? And here the idea is that it would be too much to trust happiness merely to chance, right? It would be in some way defective to say that happiness can only come from chance. and say that it's never possible to work at becoming happy. Though he is still open to this sort of slight qualification that one could be so unlucky that one could never actually achieve a flourishing or happy life. He thinks that there has to be some external goods, some preconditions must exist and cooperate with you in order for you to actually get to the level of being able to start being happy. And those kinds of things are going to be like, you have to be born into the right kind of society or the right kind of like family where you're not neglected, where your parents actually take a little bit of care of you and try and teach you in the ways of, how a child should start to learn to be moral. You need enough money for food, right? If you don't have enough money for food, like as you're starting off, you're not going to be able to live in the way that's sort of noble and provides for virtuous activity, because you might have to start stealing right away as a child, right? Like or something like that. He thinks that like certain basic external goods are necessary in order to sort of set you off on the right path. And this is again another kind of political point that Aristotle wants, I think, to make, especially insofar as we need there to be laws and political systems and institutions set up that undergird the ability, give a sort of social safety net for those at the bottom in order for them to actually be lifted up to the basic point where they can start trying to live happy lives by cultivating their virtues and trying to learn how to live in flourishing ways. Kind of restriction here that Aristotle places on his version of what he means here is that like happiness is something that requires a certain level of maturity. So children and non-human animals are excluded from his sort of strict notion of happiness because they can't yet exercise or complete all the virtuous rational activity that is necessary in order to be living one of these lives that we would call a flourishing life, right? Calling a child happy, he thinks, is sort of anticipatory. It's leading the witness in a sense, saying that they're going to live a happy life. Whereas talking about a child's happiness sort of in the moment, it's clearly fleeting, right? I mean, at one moment a toddler is laughing, and at the next moment the toddler is crying. You don't want to say, oh, they were happy and now they're sad in some sort of like full-bodied sense, right? Insofar as the happiness is fleeting in that case, it's just that, they were going about their day feeling fine, and then they had this wave of emotion that caused them to cry, or maybe they got hurt or something like that, right? This is not the kind of happiness that Aristotle is talking about. Aristotle's happiness is much deeper and more complex than that. Following up on this idea of happiness requiring a certain level of maturity, there is this sort of worry, though, that Aristotle addresses, that a true life can't really be called a flourishing or happy one until after someone has died. You need to see the end of their life to actually be able to attribute to them a complete flourishing life. The worry here is that of the sort of famous king of Troy, Priam, who at the end of the siege of Troy is kind of too old to fight and ends up seeking sanctuary, I think, in the Temple of Zeus, and ends up basically just being like captured, dragged through the blood of his sons, and then ran through with a sword. And so the ultimate tragedy at the end of his life is supposed to be seen as kind of a possible case where someone that lived a rather full, flourishing life had a radical reversal at the end, which makes their life more a tragedy than a triumph. But in this case, Aristotle rejects the implication that happiness can only be attributed posthumously. He doesn't think that you have to have died before we can agree that you're living a happy, flourishing life. because that would be absurd if happiness is an activity, right? Like the end of a life, the person is no longer fulfilling that activity. So he thinks we need to distinguish the sort of constitutive core, the sort of thing that creates the happiness, from the conditions surrounding the happiness. Of course, then, so he thinks that like the fortunes of someone's life can affect happiness, especially through large events that enable or obstruct certain kinds of virtuous activity. But virtuous activities are more stable and durable than external circumstances are, right? So there's these more. If you have cultivated the virtues, you've got a stable core of activities, a stable core of ways that you can think, feel, and act that, come what may, will be the same. Aristotle thinks that the excellent person responds to fortune nobly and makes the best of circumstances, right? So the idea being that, come what may, if a person has sort of lived the correct kind of life to become the happy kind of person, the flourishing kind of person, even if tragedy has struck them, they will be able to sort of roll with the punches. This is not a form of sort of invulnerability. It's not that, like Stoicism teaches, that you can just kind of internally decide how it is that you're going to respond in all situations. No, Aristotle thinks that there are correct ways. There are sometimes even correct times to be extremely heartbroken and sad, and maybe even depressed if something extremely bad happens to you. He allows for there to be multiple grave disasters that can sort of crush and maim a person's happiness, and someone like Priam, their misfortunes will like sort of lead their life to not be, in retrospect, a life that was a complete flourishing life, but that doesn't take away from the virtuous person's abilities to be able to respond in the right kinds of ways to the right kinds of situation, right? This doesn't make it the case that the truly virtuous person is going to be someone that's miserable, since it doesn't some tragedy occurring to that person doesn't sort of force them into acting in a baser way, right? Like that's where you would see it. If something bad happens to someone, if their immediate response is to go, get drunk or become curmudgeonly, become awful and evil person, right? Become a bad person, then they didn't have the virtues to begin with. So Aristotle wants to say that happiness is stable not because it's untouched by misfortune, but because the primary source of the happiness, of the sustained activity of excellence in your actions, is much more durable than the ways that things fluctuate with respect to what happens in your life. What about, though, cases where a person that seems to have been particularly happy or living a flourishing life dies, and then that person's children or other descendants go on to kind of squander their good name, squander their fortune, squander, what it is that's come of them? Can it not be the case that someone's happiness or someone's, reflection on someone's life as having flourished, could it not be that we come to decide later that actually they didn't have a flourishing life because of something that their children or descendants do? And Aristotle here wants to say, to give a kind of denial, because he thinks that it would be sort of contrary to common belief, that there some kind of posthumous influence can result in our reassessing how we think of a dead person and whether or not their life was sort of a perfect one, I guess. But we can't like fluctuate constantly back and forth between saying that a person was happy and a person was miserable, just dependent upon how their descendants have fared. So a kind of compromise is found by Aristotle, where he thinks that, look, the events involving descendants of an individual can affect the dead in some attenuated sense, but the effects are weak or negligible. They can't transform someone that was unhappy into someone that turns out to be happy, nor can they strip a person of being living a flourishing life into one that the life was not itself actually flourishing, right? And here, right, Aristotle is basically kind of showing that he really doesn't, he won't agree with any extreme position one way or the other. He thinks that familial and sort of civic relations are part of the extension of a good human life. They're necessary in order to live a flourishing life. But the unity and stability of the virtues once achieved can't be sort of ruined per se by something that happens outside of the individual's actions. To sort of wrap up this sort of first book, the architectonic kind of picture of Aristotle's whole view, he wants to reiterate that happiness or flourishing is something that he considers to be prized above all others, and not merely something to be praised as good. He thinks normally when we praise things such as courage or justice or strength, we do so insofar as they help us to achieve some further good. Happiness, however, isn't merely a good quality relative to something higher. It is for him the final end, the thing for its own sake that is worthy of pursuit, the thing around which all of our practical lives are organized. So it should be the thing that is prized above all others, rather than something that is simply praised. This sort of gives us like Aristotle's picture of like what it is that he really means here. Happiness is not some particular admirable good alongside others. It really is the organizing end by which we organize all other practical goods, and all other practical goods sort of slot in underneath happiness as things that we try to achieve in order to achieve happiness. At this point, Aristotle requires or needs to begin to offer us an account of what virtue actually is, in order to fully explain, what he means by happiness is activity in activity of the soul in accordance with complete virtue, right? So he has to kind of turn to what exactly the nature of virtue comes from, or how it works. And in order to do that, he gives the beginning of what we might think of as his moral psychology, or just sort of his general idea of what's got to be going on in the psychology of an agent. And he breaks this down into, he breaks it down into three parts, but there are two parts of the of the soul. There's the nutritive part of our being, which is the part of our sort of when Aristotle says soul, he really means the thing that causes us to move, right? He means something along the lines of like mind, but it's not in the sense of mind that we think of, where it's like, something that's just in our head. The soul is sort of the thing that gives us life, right? The thing that gives us movement. And one sort of part of the soul, the thing that allows us to move, right, but isn't sort of in the mental part, is the nutritive part of the soul. But this, he thinks, is something that is shared among plants, animals, everyone, that everything that's basically alive, and it's continually operating even, when you're asleep. And sort of the excellence and defect of your body is something that isn't inherently or distinctively human, right? So like having a diseased body, like of course there are specifically human diseases, but these are the kinds of things that can affect animals and plants as well. And so, being excellent with respect to the nutritive element of the soul, or the nutritive element of the body, is neither here nor there. Instead, he wants to focus on the other two parts of the soul that really he thinks matter for our thinking, and that he thinks matter for virtue itself. And those are the sort of appetitive part of the soul and the rational part of the soul. The appetitive part of the soul is that which is constructed, it's non-rational, and it's constructed of our appetites and desires. This part of the soul can oppose reason, or it can fall into line with reason. The idea being there that, you can have desires that are not the right thing to do, right? Reason is the thing that tells you what the right thing to do in the situation is. Your desires don't always align with reason, right? You know that you need to study for the test tomorrow, but you don't feel like it. You'd rather go out with your friends, right? This is one of those situations where Aristotle famously has this thing called akrasia that he talks about, which is the weakness of will. And the weakness of will is sort of the inability for you to overcome your appetites and desires by means of rationally accepting what the correct thing that you ought to do in this sort of situation is. We'll get into that in more detail as things go on. But here, so the idea is that really there are these two parts. There's the kind of rational part of the soul that is involved, and it itself is actually distinguished into, for Aristotle, like a contemplative or science and mathematics driven side, the kind of thing that does like technical reasoning, and then the deliberative side of the soul, of the rational component, which focuses on practical reasoning, things that we ought to do. So really here, he's going to focus almost exclusively on the deliberative part of the rational part of the soul and its relationship and how it stands to appetites and desires that we have, and the relationship that sort of the attempts that it has to exude control over those kinds of things. And within the soul's division, then, we end up with a division of different kinds of virtue, namely virtues that apply to the appetitive and desirous part of our soul, and the virtues that apply to the rational part of our soul. The rational part is the virtues of things like wisdom and understanding, and in particular with respect to deliberation, practical wisdom, being able to know what the right thing is to do at the right time, and so on and so forth. But with the moral virtues, the things that we're considering and mostly focusing on here, are going to have more to do with the control of our desires, insofar as we're able to come to know what it is that the right thing is to do. So moral virtue is neither like irrational impulse nor bare intellectual knowledge. It's kind of this combination of both our desiring part and our rational part, attempting to help train our desiring part to do the right thing in the right way through habituation. And we'll come back to this when we discuss the sort of doctrine of the mean and all of the things that Aristotle has to do with thinking about how the virtues operate and what the virtues are. And that kind of helps culminate his entire program and helps us understand how happiness and the virtues relate to one another. And the way that that's going to be is that, like, a person with a morally virtuous character is going to be a person that's able to control the appetites that they have, the desires that they have, and to bring those appetites and desires in line with what reason tells us ought to be done. And what reason tells us ought to be done are the things that are the good things to do, the things that are the virtuous things to do. And so in the end, basically, that's how this whole the whole rest of this text is going to go, is Aristotle trying to show how the interplay between appetites and desires and the rational components of our soul or our mind affect one another, where we've got sort of these intellectual components, thinking about practical reasoning, thinking about practical wisdom. How do we develop those things in order to help guide our own appetites and desires? How do our appetites and desires sort of flare up? How do we tamp them down? Those kinds of things, and then the situations that they'll arise in. So the end then of book 1 here really kind of brings together the entire research program that Aristotle is undertaking here, where he thinks that in order to understand happiness, we have to explain the virtues. In order to explain the virtues, we have to explain the rational and desiring structures of our human soul. And to explain those things, we have to explain how to cultivate and habituate and learn to choose the correct actions that we're going to undertake using deliberation. And then he thinks that to go sort of beyond that and bring about a sort of more political bent on it, we can attempt to sort of see how certain public endeavors could allow people or help people to be able to further their own abilities when it comes to controlling their desires, getting their desires to line up with the virtues of character. And we can do that by enacting laws that keep people in line and providing political education for them. And so in the end, the whole sort of program is before us, and that's where we're going from here on out. We're going to be talking next about the structure of the virtues, the different kinds of virtues that exist, and then when we get to book 5, we'll discuss justice itself, what the just society looks like.